Hoy en la Hora Maker hablaremos con Nettrice Gaskins, una de las referencias a nivel mundial en educación STEAM. Entrevista en inglés en 3, 2, 1. Let's go.
I'm currently at the Fab Foundation in Boston, and it's a program called SCOPES, DF, Scaling Community of Practice through digital fabrication. And it's started in July of last year or something like that, and I came in November, and so sort of it's the second phase, which the first phase was getting lesson plans up on the web for a website. So Fab Lab, people at Fab Labs just submit lessons that were curated and Fab tested, and then made it 20 to 29 were finished, and 9 were not Fab tested, the other 20 were, and they went up on the website for the phase 1 part. We came in November, website went up, and we put the lessons on the website. Phase 2 is working with high schools. High schools with, I guess, Fab Labs. Okay. So high schools with Fab Labs, and so we wanted to help those schools or work with those schools to co-design a program to bring digital fabrication into the classroom. And that means high school, but it could be K to 12 in the end. But we had to start somewhere. So we started with these 2 high schools, and each school has their own culture, their own approach to STEM. So Fab Foundation, my day job is STEM. My other job is promoting the A for STEAM. And so STEM has been around for a while, and people in STEM education, it came out of the National Science Foundation. They wanted to sort of meet the needs of a global market and a global education by saying that there should be some overlap or some cross sections between science and technology, engineering and math. Didn't really happen. So they, somewhere in around 2011, the Rhode Island School of Design held this big party meeting where people came from all over to talk about STEAM as a possibility to add art for A and design, if you want to put it in there. So I think the important part of the thing was that you can't really talk about innovation without talking about creativity. And you can't talk about the kind of processes of invention and innovation without talking about how people go through some sort of design mechanism or practice. So the other areas sort of do scientific method, have other engineering thinking processes, but not necessarily fitting quite into the creativity. So the art was we add art to bring innovation more. STEM wasn't innovative enough. STEAM, possibly. So that's how that came about. And so people have been interested, not just in the United States, but around the world in terms of a holistic education. So the whole person, the whole kid or whole child, whole student, and you're really looking to STEAM as the way to do that.
Okay, and one of the topics you have explored is the techno-vernacular creativity, like how different communities have different approaches and different languages in terms of aesthetics. And if you could explain what do you mean by techno-vernacular creativity in this context of STEAM?
Well, there are communities of practice that do creative works that involve STEM concepts, STEM science, technology, engineering, math, one or more of those areas in their work, but they do it from a way that's from local knowledge, not from a dominant mainstream knowledge, but from knowledge from a community, or for community of practice, and more specifically. So it could be hip hop, it could be within hip hop subgroups of graffiti, where I started talking to graffiti artists friends of mine who I found talk about mathematics a lot, and I'm like, this is math. Maybe there's a connection between graffiti and math, and turns out there is. Or talking about John Coltrane jazz, studied Einstein's theory of relativity, but he did it in a way that fit within a jazz aesthetic, whereas Einstein was really classical and spent a lot of time with the violin to do his thinking around his experiments. But it's art. So Einstein and violin, John Coltrane, jazz musician, talking about quantum physics, we are having this intersection of disciplines to sort of create new bodies of work. That was interesting to me, the graffiti point of view, looking at math, understanding that some groups were using science, citizen science, in their work, but from their own point of view, their own local knowledge, their own local customs, their local rituals, everyday practices, and those are innovative, but nobody ever talked about them. I centered my work on Grandmaster Flash because Grandmaster Flash is a well-known DJ. He's pioneer in DJing around the world, and he's even used scientific methods in his approach to creating innovation within DJing. So if that's the case, and he's a self-taught engineer, why not talk about him and engineering when we talk about engineering and innovation? It never happens, but here's an innovator from a hip-hop aesthetic, from a particular way of life. And so those stories, I find, my thesis was that these examples will engage kids who are not interested in STEM. At all, and don't see a connection, don't see representation. Could be, and I talk a lot about some of the guys, but I also talk about the possibility for girls, which we can talk about. But the vernacular part is important because it's relevance. And if it's not relevant to me, I'm not interested. If you can't express to me why a topic is interesting and relevant to where I come from, I'm just not attached to it. I don't want to learn it, and I'm going to get disengaged from. And so techno-vernacular creativity is looking at those examples and making them clear so that young people, other people, academics, scholars can understand that there's all this work is being done, and we don't talk about it enough, but this is the way in for a lot of people who are not already into STEM and STEAM.
And for people that may be wondering, because we have no photos, we have no idea. For people might be wondering, what does it look like? How does it express through some examples? I understand that it's not just the aesthetics, like the way it looks or the way it presents itself, but also the ways of doing, like how do we mix, how do we cut, how do we rearrange, bringing the hip hop way of understanding painting just to create something based on these same principles. So it's more like the looks, or it's like the way you do, or it's like the mixer.
A combination of that. Something I did more recently that just blew my mind and I blew other people's mind. So there's these scholars, and some of those scholars are no longer alive, but these scholars have this theory that in Black cultural production, there's a connection to repetition, looping, sampling, and the cut, which is a disruption and a sequence. And you find that in music, you find it in literature, you find it in performance. And so then there's this woman who looks at quilts and says that in African American quilts, you find the same kinds of patterns you find in the music. So people have these theories, and then ties it to textiles and things like that. So I said, well, what if I took this visualization program I used to produce my work, and what if I played James Brown's Cold Sweat, which is mentioned in the essay, and what happens to the design? Does it look like African fabric? It does.
It does.
It does. It in fact matched the particular African textile when I played the music, and it responded. And then I laser etched it on felt, and and when I point out the design, I said, that is James Brown's Cold Sweat.
And people were like,
yeah,
boom.
Yeah. And it ties in those theories, using digital fabrication specifically, and algorithms and things like that. But it's true, there seems to be a connection between what this guy theorized many years ago and what they're saying about design today. Using digital fabrication, it was digital fabrication that made that possible.
One of the things I've heard you're also working into is this creating STEAM curriculum based on current culture, like Black Panther, just to engage young people. How did you came with this idea, and what is the response from people? Are like studies?
Ruth Carter, who's the costume designer for Black Panther, and Hannah Beachler is the production designer. They both did really cool things for the film. Ruth Carter, well, they all went to Africa, and they were mostly African American. They had to walk around and understand the cultures, and not just take stuff, but learn about what it meant, and do serious research. And so did the director, Ryan Coogler, did that. Ruth Carter came back, and then she decided to use digital fabrication to create some of the costumes. So when Queen Ramonda's crown is 3D printed, she tweeted algorithms, South African basket weaving and math or something like that, and 3D printing. And I saw the tweet and I'm like, wow, that's STEAM right there. So in addition to the crown that's 3D printed, it's pretty big, so that's a big printer. There's also this bodice that the Queen wears, which is also 3D printed. And there were more things 3D printed in there that doesn't appear to be, but is digitally fabricated. And then Hannah Beachler kind of had this sort of taking and appropriating cultures in a way that didn't offend the cultures because they were so prominent in the film, but mixing them in her designs. So they all took this kind of remixing and sort of reappropriation, but in a way that was honoring those cultures in a sense that I'm hearing from my Nigerian American friends that in Nigeria, very seldom do Nigerian audiences come out the way they did for Black Panther, but as soon as Mbaku opened his mouth, there was a yay because he was speaking a Nigerian accent, and that all these different people from around the world would come in, yay, there was something in there. The warrior women, the Dora Milaje, their boots are Japanese style, tabby style boots. So they're using a Japanese style boot, and the reason for that is Ruth Carter didn't think it's realistic that women warriors would fight in heels or fight in shoes that were impractical. So you look there, the split toe shoes, and if you're into rough terrain, that really helps you to sort of stand, keep your ground. So let's pick up a practical shoe design. So she uses Japanese style. I know some of the clothing was by this Filipino designer as well. So as you're thinking about other cultures and thinking about vernacular, thinking about digital fabrication and STEM. And they wanted to create a futuristic but yet build on traditional ancient practices and vernacular in a new world that they could make up. And I felt like we could take some of those things and we can create that boot again. Let's create the style of the boot. Let's explore what it'd be like to fabricate that boot, and let's add some interactives, put some electronics in it. So there's a soft sensor when you press down, it lights up. Let's do some things with the boot. So that was the first project. And then said, let's do something a little more practical because that's a lot of stuff. Let's look at jewelry, and let's see if we can take some of the symbols and go into Tinkercad and really create some really cool jewelry based on these symbols we see in the film. So yeah, there's all this kind of really smart decisions and things that these designers were doing that was interesting, and I felt could be an interesting digital fabrication project.
And how did the students receive that? They felt more engaged to the practice, or they felt like they were exploring something worthwhile, or? So
I created, it was my idea to do the Black Panther. People can tell you differently, but I was like, just because Ruth was tweeting, and then I would go and look, and there's a South African K-12 curriculum on those designs for math. And then I would take that snapshot of that page from that curriculum. I can't get the whole book for some reason. And then I would say, here, Ruth. And I would say this. And then I would tag Ruth. And then she would retweet it. And all these people would mind blown. And then I'm like, I'm just reading what Ruth says. So this past week, or today's Monday, so last week, the one program, the Brilliant Career Lab, GE partnership, they have a mobile lab space. They decided to go to a program in Boston University and test out the second lesson, which is the jewelry, which isn't out yet. The kids loved it. Kids really, took to it. They fabricated, they created and remixed their symbols, and you did laser cutting and 3D printing. So they actually fab tested the lesson that we created for the jewelry, and it turns out it's a success. There were some tweaks. We're not just most Fab Labs use certain software, so they use Inkspace. We always say Inkscape. Yeah. We always say Inkspace, so for the reason, and then I start saying it. And then they use certain. So I added a program that I helped to create with the folks at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which takes cultural symbols and allows you to learn coding like Scratch to recreate them, simulate them, and then take that symbol and then 3D print it or whatever. So that's what happened. And it turns out they like it. It turns out it was successful. So at least with that round with those students.
That sounds great. One of the things that in the end it's all about inviting people to do things using digital fabrication that are related to your own interests, instead of like, oh, what can I do with digital fabrication? Oh, to print a 3D printer. Okay, maybe for some people that's interesting enough. For some other people it's like you said, oh, I don't really care about these 3D printers. I just want to create my clothing or my whatever. But I feel in the end it's a way to feel welcome in a place, to feel being able to contribute and to do stuff. And as I was reading through some of your previous presentation, I think that one of the things that really made it clear for me was the difference between being open and being inclusive. Like, and I would like for you to explain it, like what's the difference between like being just open or being inclusive, because most people maybe have this like STEM, or they're all the same, but and here in the first year we had the Makespace had the same idea, like, oh, we open the doors and we are open to the public and all kind of people can come through the door, but in the end it's more like all the time the same kind of people. So after kind of a couple of years we just realized like maybe we're missing something, and I think it's all related to this conversation. So maybe you can explain about this, how to be more.
So the Nation of Makers came out through Obama's administration, and as soon as he realized he was done, he realized whoever's coming in next will get rid of this program, so let's make it a nonprofit. So it's still alive and exists, and has this first conference in like a week or two. So one of the things that they had, we went to the White House and we sat at the White House, 2 people per state, I guess, and we had to sit in our regions and talk about equity specifically. And they define equity in 3 ways: diversity, inclusion, and access. So who has the keys, who's in the room, and who feels welcome. And that all 3 of those things have to be at play when you're talking about equity issues, not just inclusion, but how diverse is it, and then who has access. And I thought that was a smart way to think about equity, because people throw the word around equity, but then they separate it from diversity and they separate it from access and all these other things. So yeah.
It's about to blow. No.
So that's a real question. And then I think about when I first learned electronics, I was a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And it was a not-for-credit course that was all about electronics. And so I showed up and a bunch of other people showed up because they were asked to come. And then I got lost interest at some point and stopped going. Because there were projects I wanted to do, but there was nobody there to work on those projects with. They just wanted to make golf clubs with stuff inside of them, and I'm not interested in golf. They were more interested in the mechanics. I wanted to make like games and cultural games and things like that, and I was like, well, I can just make that on my own now that I know how to do this stuff. So I just went and did that, and made a game. But it felt at some point that there's a conversation happening and I'm not part of that conversation. Yeah. So I'm just going to go either create my own conversation over here, or I'm just going to go do my own thing over here. And so, there was kind of a question about why I didn't show up again. But most of the time it's like, if you don't want to show up, you don't want to show up. Yeah. But no one really wanted to know why, because they had a feeling it might have something to do with the thing that they were happy talking about. And, and didn't care that the women didn't want to have those conversations. And so when I talk about equity or inclusion, you have to include access and you have to include diversity, because those things sort of have to work together to have the issue of equity. Otherwise, you're having these uneven things happening where you have access but no inclusion, or you have inclusion, and then no access and things like that. And so I think that from my point of view, I'm not interested in mechanics. I can do that. I'm pretty confident about my ability to solder and use the laser cutter and use it on my own. I don't feel intimidated by that stuff. But I'm really interested in art. Yeah. And I'm really interested in cultural expression and aesthetics and textiles and design and things that maybe some people are not that interested in. So when I work with girl students, it tends that's what they're interested in too. So maybe there's a correlation. I don't want to do that and say, so there aren't girls out there interested in robotics, because I know there are girls interested in robotics. But they're not as, they're outliers in a sense, because they're interested in robotics for other things, like education and things like that. And I think that if you include those activities and you include those conversations and those projects, you're going to invite more women in, for example, or girls in. And we had a workshop today that showed just that. The girls were actually, we had more girls than we had guys in Cuenca. So, and those girls, when they did very aesthetic, you know, and what they were doing on and not thinking about it, is that they were really doing electronics and figuring out the mechanics, but doing it through a lens of art and design.
So maybe including the art is a way to have more inclusive and diverse. Is there any other thing that you would suggest for, I assume you have into several different spaces and being like in all kind of educational context, and maybe there are some suggestions like how to make the space more inclusive to all different kind of people, communities. I don't know if you have any particular.
I know that Susan's shop and Mel King's shop over at the South End Technology Center, they get paid, but they also don't have to go. They can get other jobs. The kids that come there feel like they have a place they belong in, and they feel like they have other peers that are like them that are there. So there are some girls and there's some guys, and they're working together over a period of time. And there's representation. If there's no representation, it's hard. If you walk into a room and there are people that look like you probably don't think much about it. If I walk in a room and there's people that look like you, I'm like, where are people like me? Okay. And if I do that enough times, either I'm going to just get used to it, or I'm going to say, maybe I don't go to those conferences anymore, or I don't go to those meetings anymore, or show up at that space anymore. And so that's the part that I think people like, what's wrong with this, you know, these meetings, or what's wrong with this space? But you're comfortable there. You are, but are others who are not quite like you, are they comfortable in the space? And that's a question that people don't ask themselves usually. And then when women try to bring it up, there's hostility. Well, get your own space. And then if you get your own space, why do they have their own space? So there's always like this pushback. Even at the conference, there was an issue of women in STEM conversation. I was like, why is there women in STEM at a STEAM conference? You know, like when they're going to talk about art and girls, because, you know, we want to talk. So they were like, yeah, absolutely.
I get the point. Yeah, it's something that has happened also here when we were planning our breakers course that involves people coming from all kind of different backgrounds. We have people from Africa, we have people from all kind of different countries. And one of the things, when we were planning for our first course, we were saying like, okay, this is going to be a super intensive day. People are going to enjoy that much. It's going to be crazy with all kind of activities. And there, one of the educators that we were working with said, okay, you have to realize this is the Ramadan end of the month. So people are dead. Like if you planning activities after lunchtime, where you are going to have people having pizzas near to people that are not going to be eating anything, and you expect like the energy levels to be the same, it's going to be absolutely catastrophe, you know? And we have to figure out and to arrange, like to make sure that everyone was quite welcome, and it was not like, oh yeah, we're having our party here, you are there, like do whatever you want. It was more like, and then as you work with different contexts, you start realizing like, okay, let's figure out and how to make it more easy for people to feel invited to participate, and in a way that people feel more welcome or more invited to do stuff.
And then the story I told at the Women in STEM panel is they were talking about how do we get girls into STEM? And they were like, we don't know. And they're women. So, you know, it's like, okay, well, that didn't get answered. I said, here's a clue. I'm not saying it's the only answer. It's not. But I said, you know, my mother was a computer programmer. Hated computers. I wanted to be an artist. And I had no interest in computers at all until my art teacher, who taught me ceramics, one day decided to teach computer graphics. And when she asked me to take the class, I said, no, I don't like computers. And so she said, well, you need an elective. And so I liked the teacher, and as she asked me more than once, so I said I should probably take this class. So I took this class, and she started. It was she had an amazing ceramics room. So she had a kiln, like a great kiln, and she had like the slab roller. So she didn't. I guess the district didn't give her computers yet. So she brought a Commodore 64 from her house, her basement, and put it on a slab roller and said, "Welcome to computer graphics." So we were all like, "Slab roller, Commodore 64, like, what do you mean? What is this what's gonna happen here?" And sure enough, she got a lab, and within a couple of weeks. But once I learned how to make art with computers, I was hooked. And she saw it. I mean, and that's what I majored in college. I still had to do computer programming, which I didn't like, but I was able to do it, and I knew I could do it because my mother did it. But a lot of girls don't see that representation. I had to teach advanced placement computer science last year to high school students who had never taken computer science before. And they had an issue with, because most of those students, 16 students, were girls. And most of them were Latino and African American, with a couple Asian students and so on. I didn't think I could teach the class because I didn't ever see a Black woman teach computer science. Wow. And so I was in awe that there were kids still in the class every day. I taught every day for a year. I said, they're still coming. Why is that? I would be like in a shock if kids would show up and they're there in the morning, and I'm like, they're still coming. And I'm like, that means they like something about this class. So, and the principal was like, of course, like, hello. But I did a year-long computer science class with art students who would meet those areas that are not included in computer science. And they did amazing things, like they composed music to data visualization. So just followed and composed music. So, but I didn't believe I could do it at first because I didn't see the representation. And they didn't believe they could do it because they didn't have that exposure. So the more exposure you give folks, the more representation, the more engagement you have.
And in the end, it's expanding the tools, the modalities they can have to express whatever they want. But I think that has to be this click on the head, like, oh, I can use this for that. That was unintended, unexpected, and incredible in a way, isn't it? I think we are around 30 minutes, and there are more people here that maybe I have some questions. So I'm going to launch my last one that I always launch before finishing the interviews. I always ask people to recommend me something to interview. like maybe there is someone that you say, okay, you should ask this question to that person, or maybe you should explore this topic with that particular person. So I don't know if you have any.
Talk to Dan Smithwick. He's the master fabricator at Fab Foundation.
Okay.
There's one. He's an architect PhD, but now is K-12. And I think has some interesting ways he approaches, because he doesn't, when he did the Black Panther thing, these symbols were foreign to him, and he was able to learn, research, and figure out their meanings, and then really take it to the next level in a way I haven't seen before. Okay, so I keep this on my to interview list that is growing bigger every day. I don't know if any of you have some questions about. So thank you for being here. We are very happy because this is our first open event where people are even in this place, in this format that we are still exploring. So we are very happy to have you here. And I'd like to thank Anna just for enabling this. And now let's have something just to drink and share and enjoy together. Yes. So thank you. Okay.